Hi, I'm Joe Starnes.
Hey, I'm Pete Lamb, and we're going to have another one of our discussions, another one of our coffee chats here this morning. We're working you in. What we're going to talk about this morning is, what works in your system. Well, in fact, what we're really going to talk about is how does your system even work? That's not what works in your system, is how does your system even work? You know, I hear a lot of folks, and folks are crazy enough to actually call me for advice. And I had a chief call me the other day, and he said, listen, I don't know much about SOPs. So what I'm going to do is, we got a neighboring department. They got all kinds of SOPs. I'm going to I got a copy of them, and I think I'm going to have my assistant print those off on our letterhead. Because after all, we got NFPA standards, and their firefighters are firefighter one, and my firefighters are firefighter one, and it's all the same. I don't know. What do you think about that, Joe? Is that a good idea? Or I'll save what I told them, but what do you think about that?
I think they ought to get somebody, if they're a volunteer station with about 24 members, they probably ought to get FDNY, SOP, and copy it. I think it's just about as useful. Not that their SOP is not useful to FDNY, but it won't be useful to you. What matters is what you talk about, what you teach, and what you practice, and then the outcomes that you desire. I had an old fire chief that was my mentor, and he told me, I asked him what his number one piece of advice was. He said, beat them there and make sure they stay alive. And I always remembered that line, because I was trying to find some SOP or some volume, but what matters is what you say and what you do locally. You've got to say what you're going to do, write it down, do what you say, and call early if you can't do it. If you can do those things, you can write an SOP. An SOP that starts with 5 lines and ends up being 10 pages is a lot better than an SOP that starts at 10 pages and ends up being 5 lines. So we've got to do it locally. This thing, it's great to benchmark or look at other people and learn from them, but the bottom line, we have to do it locally.
No, I don't disagree. And, you said a mouthful there, and I just want to reiterate a couple of things. Is if you don't have SOPs, and there are departments, Joe, as we record this here, we're in December of 2014. There are many small departments out there that just don't have SOPs. They don't have it. And I think what you said is paramount, and that is write down what you currently do. Figure out what emergencies you respond to. Figure out what you currently do and write that down. And then kind of measure that against what you think ought to happen. If what you do, and you've got a pretty good system about that, I think a company officer, or if you've got an SOP on a motor vehicle accident with the extrication, jaws of life, whatever it is happens to be, if you've got an SOP on that, when you come back from a run, if you're in a volunteer house before everybody goes home, or if you're in a career station, you go in the kitchen table, I think you ought to pull out your SOP and figure out what happened on that run versus what your SOP says. And then what do you do about that, Joe? If you come up with something different there, if you come up with some variable there, what do you do about that?
The old adage of span of control, sphere of influence. If you're in a volunteer station and you just came back from a let's say an automobile accident with pin in, and you did your thing there, or write down on a little. We did it originally on just a whiteboard. Well, actually, we did it on the side of a white refrigerator. If you write down what you think should happen and look at what happened, and it's just put yes, no. At the end, do it again, talk about it, and then you'll start to evolve into the changes that you need to make that look like SOP changes. And when they look like they're really honed and good practices, and you can do them with the crew you have, then write it down as a standard. Write it down as something we want. This is a standard ought to be their vision of it's like a resume. It ought to be the best you ever look. And you ought to be doing that and evaluating that after every use of that standard, every use of that writing down you did. And then that'll help your board of directors, if you're a volunteer, to buy the right equipment for you. It tells them what you're missing, what you need, what kind of support you need. It will be the most calls you run. That'll be important. If you run 80% of your calls doing one thing, you probably ought to put a lot of your time on those 80%. And then if you use Gordon Graham's model of high risk, low frequency, non-discretionary time, then you ought to focus on those places where that you're not upping your skills. You're not refreshing yourself enough so that when you do have that high risk moment with it doesn't happen very often and you don't have time to call for help. You got to make the decision right then. That's when we get hurt. So if you write it down and then evaluate it after you write it down, it could be as simple as on a dry erase board or a blank sheet of paper. If you do that each time, your SOP will evolve and your training will evolve to support your SOP and your resources will evolve to resource that SOP that you've said that's how we do it. And more importantly, it ought to be the vision of how we want to do it. And that means we're probably never going to do it as well as we write it down, but we're always striving to be that vision. That's where we're headed. You want to know where we're going? That's where we're going, Chief.
All right, well, that's perfect stuff. And I'm glad you threw in the training piece, right? People look at SOPs as a binder up in the chief's office on a shelf. Your SOP is the basis of your training document. As folks listen to us, if you're a training officer, I don't know what to do for next Tuesday night drill. Well, yeah, you do. You got a book of SOPs. That's what you do. The other thing, Joe, is I think there's a national debate about this, even in large career departments to some degree, is you mentioned the Gordon Graham, and I listen to a lot of what he says as it relates to risk. I think he's really got his finger on the pulse there, and that is this high risk, low frequency event. Here's the problem that I see, Joe, is that anytime you and I get together, we kind of talk about fire behavior and the fire science of this. I think in many departments around the country, the structure fire is a high risk, low frequency event. The structure fire with someone trapped is even lower frequency event. So how could I take my SOPs? What relationship could there be between some of the research that we're learning about and is so frequently talked about? How could that research help me make my troops safer? How can I work that into an SOP model?
When we do things, so for instance, let's say we got an SOP with a minimum staffing model, like we talk about quite often. You and I have talked about quite a bit, and the one that I research most of the time has to do with where I live and breathe at Oak Grove. And that model looks for 10 volunteers to be there, and when you do that, you say, I've got credible evidence. A friend of mine told me this week, and I like the term. He says, I have credible evidence that I need to locate a person inside that IDLH. I've got credible evidence. I love that term. And when I've got credible evidence and I got a staffing that looks like this number with this resource, how would I do it safely? How does the science tell me it will help me? How can I keep the fire from growing? How can I isolate the fire from it? How can I detect where the fire is and then let that detection with thermal imaging or thermal data, we call it, and manage the flow path and direct the fire? Would I intentionally direct the fire away from a spot if I knew I had credible evidence that that was the case? Maybe I would. So those are the discussions that you do. What happens if you show up with 10 volunteers and they're not the 10 you would have picked? You would rather had at least 4 or 5 other people, but you got the 10 you got. How do you act? Do you change your risk management model? How do you use the data? Would you use more air control than interior access? Would you access quicker? Would you not? You got to think these things through. I told a fire officer the other day that his particular perception of what people ought to be when they get there ought to be couched and modified with who shows up. He ought to have more than one plan. He or she ought to have more than one way of addressing that particular incident with less skill or more skill. You got to in the volunteer system. And you ought to teach that. You ought to write it down. You ought to teach people options. These are things that we can do. When we control air, what does that mean? We shut a door. Should we put water in there before we shut the door? If we did put water in there, what would that do to the environment? Should we ever put dry air into anything? Use the forestry model. If it rains and it's humid, it doesn't burn. Moisture is the kryptonite to fire. And you, as a volunteer system, in our case, if you understand those things, don't give Superman what he needs. Put kryptonite in it. Use something that says, use the science to your benefit. If you've got a window that's going to be impinged by flame in a little bit, hang a curtain on it. If you got somebody you've got to put inside with a line, because that curtain will act like that window if when that flame hits that glass and it breaks. You will not get a flow path there. Think ahead. Use your head. Use the science. It's there. Learn to use. You can take. We started with an outer shell of a roll of outer shell gear as a curtain with a hammer stapler, and we still use it. You take that roll, you cut it 8-foot lengths, you go up to the brick mason molding, and you hammer 3 staples, and all of a sudden you got a curtain, and you don't have a flow path. That flow path is all that we're talking about. We're talking about owning that flow path and controlling it. If we do that, I can do it with 4 people like I can do it with 8. It's just a matter of adapting and using the science to your favor, Chief.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that's part of the discussion that's missing. And we've talked about this in a previous coffee chat, and that was, lots of discussion. It's time to take action. So it's time to figure out, as you look at research, whether you're at the coffee table as an engine company or ladder company or whatever you're doing, whether you're in the chief's office, whether you're at an officers meeting, figure out how the research that you're currently hearing about and all over the internet and wherever you are, wherever you're getting your information, figure out how that research fits into your SOPs and your department with the crews you have on a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. That's what you got to work with, and that's where I see we ought to go. Joe, listen, God forbid anybody want further information from either of us, but how could somebody get in touch with you if they wanted to hear more about this subject?
You can email me, Chief, at joe@joestarnes.com. It's pretty simple. If you can remember the problem, you got the address, joe@joestarnes.com. Thank you, sir. And
All
you.
right, that's great. And you can also find me at pete@peteliam.com. And you can listen to me if you even so desire to do that. Listen to me on the Firefighter Training Podcast. We'll talk to you again. You can bet on it.